Across the vast chambers of the Galactic Assembly, representatives of countless species sat in stunned silence. The declaration had come without warning, broadcast across the stars with the weight of an empire behind it that on the massive central display. Queen Xylara of the Kari Dominion stood in ceremonial war armor, her presence both regal and imposing. Her violet eyes burned with intensity as she spoke. Humanity, you have encroached upon the Veil Expanse, a sector that rightfully belongs to the Kari. Our laws demand that such matters be settled with honor. Thus, I issue this challenge. Send your greatest warrior to face mine. A duel to settle this claim. Victory grants dominion. Defeat means surrender. The silence following her words was deafening. Did no species in the assembly dare to interrupt? This was no idle threat. The Kari Dominion had ruled by the blade for over 1,000 cycles. They were a species born for war. Their warriors trained from birth to wield weapons and crush lesser civilizations through single combat. Their champions were undefeated. Their duels were a tradition older than many empires, and now they had turned their attention to Earth. Inside the human delegation chamber, voices erupted in hushed but urgent debate. She's bluffing, one diplomat muttered. They just want to humiliate us. Or they think we'll refuse, another countered. Which means they take the sector by default. If we back down, we lose, without a fight. General Mason, a veteran of Earth's military, leaned forward in his chair, hands folded. He had spent years analyzing alien warfare, and the Kari's approach didn't surprise him. This was how they had expanded their empire, through fear, tradition, and an unbroken record of victories. But something about this challenge amused him. They expect us to play their game, Mason said finally. His voice cut through the argument like a blade. They think we'll send a soldier, someone they can measure in strength, skill, and honor. Ambassador Wei, the lead diplomat, exhaled sharply. And if we do? Mason smiled. Then we lose? A cold silence settled over the room. Wei's expression darkened. Then what's your suggestion? Mason leaned back, his grin widening. We give them a duel, but not the one they're expecting. The Kari War Arena was a sight to behold, that a coliseum of black stone. Its design was meant to intimidate and impress. Thousands of Kari warriors lined the stands, their chants echoing through the open sky as they awaited the spectacle. At the center of the arena stood Viacor, the greatest duelist of his generation. 7 feet of muscle, clad in the ceremonial armor of his people, with a weapon forged from the bones of his defeated foes, that he had fought 100 duels and never lost. At the opposite end of the arena, a single human stepped forward at no armor. No weapon, just a man in a plain black jumpsuit, hands in his pockets. His expression unreadable, the Kari murmured among themselves. Confusion rippled through the crowd. Queen Xylara, seated high above on her throne, narrowed her eyes. Who is this? She asked at a human officer standing in the observation box smiled. Your Majesty, this is our champion. Xylara''s brow furrowed. This is not a warrior. The officer simply shrugged. That's what makes it interesting. Viacor frowned, gripping his blade. He could sense no fear, no tension, no battle spirit in the human standing before him. It was as if the man saw this not as a fight, but as a formality. The gong sounded. Viacor lunged forward, his blade cutting through the air in a blur. The human tilted his head slightly, that Viacor's strike missed by an inch. At a whisper of movement, a shift of weight, a slight adjustment in stance, and suddenly, Viacor felt something he had never known in his entire life. Doubt. The human hadn't moved much, but in that fraction of a second, everything about the duel had changed. The Kari crowd fell silent. The duel had just begun, and for the first time, it felt as though it was already over. The human sighed, his hands still in his pockets. That was your best opening move? Thousands of Kari warriors, bred for battle and raised in the ways of combat, watched in frozen disbelief. Their champion, Viacor the Unbroken, had just launched a perfect opening strike, one that had crushed countless foes. And yet, His human opponent had avoided it with nothing more than a shift of weight, a slight tilt of the head and no counterattack. No retaliation, just a movement. That Villecourt's grip tightened around his blade. He took a slow breath, his muscles tensing as he reassessed the human before him. He was a warrior, honed by years of combat and bloodshed. He had never encountered an opponent who did not react with either fear or aggression. But this man, he was different. The human hadn't even bothered to raise his hands above them. Queen Xylara's gaze narrowed. "Explain," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Did I in the observation box?" General Mason folded his arms. "Explain what?" Xylara's jaw clenched. "Who is this?" Mason smirked. "Your champion asked for our best duelist." He gestured toward the arena. "That's him?" The queen's fingers curled against the armrest of her throne. The Kari prided themselves on battle, on the purity of combat. A warrior's body was a testament to their discipline, their countless hours of training, their ability to endure pain and hardship, and yet this human, this nameless, unarmed man, stood before her greatest warrior as though the fight were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. That it was an insult, and it was terrifying. That Villecourt exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance. He could not let his first mistake define this fight. A single miss did not mean defeat. "I will give you a moment," Villecourt said, his deep voice carrying through the arena. "To draw your weapon, to take a proper stance." The human tilted his head, his hands still in his pockets. His lips twitched as if amused. "I already have?" Villecourt frowned. "You mock me?" The human sighed. "No. I'm just saying, if you think I need a weapon." He glanced at Villecourt's massive sword. "Then you've already lost." The arena erupted in anger. Kari warriors shouted in outrage at the blatant disrespect. No one spoke to Villecourt the Unbroken like that. No one. That the champion's jaw tightened. He had never fought a human before. He had studied their kind, watched their battle footage, seen their wars. He had expected resilience, perhaps even ingenuity. But this was something different. "Very well." Villecourt surged forward, his movements a blur. This time there was no caution, only brutality. His blade came down in a sweeping arc, meant to cleave the human in half. His arms tensed, prepared for impact. But there was none. The human wasn't there anymore. Villecourt's blade crashed into the ground, sending up a shower of stone and dust. He blinked. Impossible. That a whisper of movement behind him. That Villecourt turned. A single, precise impact struck him behind the knee. His leg collapsed. The pain was instant, a sharp jolt that sent him staggering forward. His balance, once perfect, was now shattered. He barely caught himself before hitting the ground. A Kari warrior did not fall. The human had done nothing but tap him. And yet, his body had reacted as if struck by a hammer. Villecourt's mind raced. That wasn't strength. That wasn't power. That was technique, perfect, merciless technique above. Xylara rose from her throne, her breath shallow. She had seen duels end in blood, in shattered bones, in desperate last stands. Never had she seen one where a champion fell from something as simple as a touch. The Villecourt inhaled sharply, gritting his teeth. He had been careless. His enemy was no fool. He would not underestimate him again. Slowly, he pushed himself up, only to freeze as the human's voice cut through the air. "That was your second mistake." Villecourt's blood ran cold. The human was standing in the exact same spot as before. Hands in pockets. Expression unreadable. He had never moved forward to attack. He had simply let Villecourt defeat himself. That Xylara clenched her fists. For the first time in her reign, she felt something new. Unease. The silence in the arena was unnatural. The Kari did not understand fear from birth. Their warriors were conditioned to accept pain, to embrace death, to believe in the unbreakable truth that they were superior to all who opposed them. Fear was something lesser beings felt. Weak, trembling creatures who lacked the discipline to master themselves. But now, for the first time in living memory, The great war arena of the Kari Dominion was silent, because Viekor the Unbroken had stumbled, because a human had done the impossible, and because no one, not even Queen Xylara herself, could explain how Viekor clenched his jaw as he steadied himself. His knee throbbed from the strike, but the pain was nothing. Pain could be endured. Doubt could not that he had miscalculated twice. That would not happen again. His grip on his sword tightened, his body coiling like a predator about to strike. This human was fast, yes, unorthodox, deceptive. But deception could not stop steel. The Viekor exhaled sharply and lunged. No hesitation. No wasted movement. Just death. He fainted high, then swept low, his blade whistling through the air, faster than the eye could track. He aimed to sever tendons, disable movement, strip the human of his cursed composure. But once again, the human wasn't there. Viekor barely registered the shift before something. A single touch, pressed against his shoulder, then his balance was gone, his body twisted. His own momentum turned against him. His footwork unraveled, his stance collapsed, and suddenly, he was falling. The moment stretched into eternity, the world spun, and then, impact. Viekor crashed into the stone floor, the force of his own failed strike slamming him into the unforgiving ground. Dust billowed from the impact, and for the first time in his life, Viekor was on his back. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The Kari, warriors who had never known defeat, watched their champion fall without a single strike being landed upon him above. Queen Xylar's hands tightened around the arms of her throne, her claws digging into the metal. This wasn't right. This wasn't possible. The human had not fought like a warrior. He had not clashed blades or exchanged blows. He had merely moved, as if combat itself was beneath him, as if Viekor was nothing more than an inconvenience. Her champion, the greatest duelist of the Dominion, lay sprawled on the floor, and the human still standing, hands in his pockets, unmarked, unbothered, and bored. Viekor forced himself up, his breath ragged, his vision blurred with rage, confusion, and something far worse, humiliation. That he was Viekor the Unbroken. His name was legend. His blade had slain hundreds. He had fought and bled and never lost, and yet this human, this nameless, weaponless thing, had reduced him to a fool. He could not accept it. Would not that a roar tore from his throat, pure fury and desperation forged into sound. He raised his blade, ready to end this insult, this mockery, this. The human sighed. Then he moved. Viekor never even saw the strike, only felt something tap his chest, that a gentle touch, almost an afterthought, and then nothing. His vision went dark, his body went limp, his consciousness faded before he even hit the ground. Silence for a long, heavy moment. No one moved. Then the human exhaled, shaking his head as if disappointed. He turned slightly, gazing up at Queen Xylar's throne. His voice was calm. Casual, is that it? The words struck harder than any blade. Queen Xylar's stomach twisted. She had witnessed countless duels. She had seen warriors fight to the death, watched champions battle for days, drenched in blood and glory. But this wasn't a duel. That it was an execution. That Viekor had fallen in seconds. Not through strength, not through speed, not even through superior firepower, through something worse, through absolute, merciless control. The human had not just defeated Viekor. He had dissected him, reduced him to a child fumbling with a sword, and now, with the weight of thousands of watching eyes, the greatest duelist of the Kari Dominion lay unconscious in the dirt. The queen's breath was shallow. The silence in the arena stretched longer, because now, the Kari knew a truth they had never considered possible. Humanity was not like them. Humanity was something else entirely. The human dusted off his sleeves. Next, Queen Xylara gripped the edge of her throne so tightly the metal groaned under her fingers. Below her, the dust settled over the fallen body of Viekor the Unbroken, her greatest warrior. Defeated in seconds, and the human, he was still standing, hands in his pockets. Barely interested. The Kari War Arena, a place that had roared with the thunder of warriors for centuries, was now choked with silence. Thousands of Kari warriors sat frozen in the stands, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. For the first time in the Dominion's history, a Kari duel had ended before it had even begun. Xylara forced herself to speak. What was that? Her voice barely carried through the stunned arena. Did I end the human observation box? General Mason leaned forward slightly, his face unreadable. That, he said, was inevitability. The Queen's claws dug into her throne. He did not fight. Mason gave her a slow, knowing smile. He didn't have to. The Kari were warriors. Their history was written in blood and conquest. Their honor was forged in combat. Every duel was a sacred test of strength, discipline, and raw skill, and yet, here stood a human who had treated the duel not as a test, but as a joke. Xylara turned her gaze to the man who had shattered the pride of her empire, that he was unremarkable, shorter than Viacor. No armor, no scars, no weapons. He did not look like a soldier, a warrior, or anything remotely dangerous, and yet, the moment he had stepped into the arena, the fight had already been over. The Queen's breath came slow and measured. You? She pointed at the human. State your name. The man shrugged. It's not important. Another insult, another crack in the foundation of the Kari's absolute certainty. That Xylara's mind raced. Every species in the galaxy had warriors, elites, champions, beings who lived for the art of battle. The Kari had dueled them all. They had fought humanity's soldiers in skirmishes before, tough, resourceful, resilient. But this wasn't a warrior, this was something else. Explain, she demanded, barely keeping her voice steady. The human sighed, tilting his head. All right, said, stepping toward Viacor's unconscious body. He nudged it lightly with the tip of his boot. This guy? He lost before the duel even started. Xylara's jaw clenched. You dare mock? I'm not mocking, the human interrupted, his voice too calm for someone standing in the heart of an empire built on war. You challenged humanity to a duel. You expected us to send a warrior. His gaze lifted, and for the first time there was something in his eyes, something cold, but we didn't. The weight of his words pressed into the stunned arena that Xylara swallowed. Then what did you send? The human smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You don't understand, do you? He gestured lazily toward Viacor's body. You sent a soldier into a fight. I sent a professional. The Queen's fingers curled. A professional what? The human sighed as if bored. Then he answered with a single word. Killer. The silence that followed was suffocating. There were warriors. There were soldiers. There were duelists, assassins, mercenaries, all trained to fight, to kill, but there was something different about killers. Warriors fought for honor. Soldiers fought for duty. Killers, they fought to end fights before they even began. Viacor had entered the duel as a warrior, proud, disciplined, steeped in tradition. His skills were meant for battle, his techniques sharpened against hundreds of opponents, but this human, he had studied one thing. The fastest possible way to remove an obstacle, and in a duel where tradition dictated skill, he had simply ignored the rules. Xylara's breathing was slow, controlled. You are no warrior. The human nodded. Correct. You disgrace the sanctity of the duel. Another nod. Also correct. She narrowed her eyes. Then what are you? The human's smile widened slightly. The thing your warriors should have been afraid of. Xylara felt something she had never felt in her long, unshaken rule. That a sliver of doubt. The human turned away, walking toward the exit. Are we done here? He asked. Xylara did not answer, because for the first time in her reign, she was no longer sure who held power in this arena. Queen Xylara sat motionless on her throne, her claws digging into the cold metal armrests. The weight of the moment pressed into her chest like an unseen force. Her people were watching. Her empire was watching, and she had no words. Below, her greatest warrior, Viacor the Unbroken, lay unconscious, defeated in seconds by a human who had barely moved. And the victor. He wasn't gloating, wasn't celebrating, wasn't even acknowledging his victory. That he was leaving. The human strode toward the exit, hands still in his pockets, shoulders loose. His body language carried no sign of caution, no awareness of danger. Because he didn't believe there was any, that truth hit harder than a blade. Xylvana's hands tightened further. She couldn't allow this. Not like this. The Kari Dominion had never known defeat. Not in 1,000 cycles. They had conquered, subjugated, and stood atop the galactic order because they were the greatest warriors in existence. Yet now, in the heart of their own war arena, in front of thousands of their finest, that belief had been shattered. And if she allowed this human to leave unpunished, the fracture would grow into a wound too deep to heal. She couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't let that happen. Xylvana rose from her throne. Stop him. Her voice, sharp and unwavering, cracked through the stunned silence. The guards stationed along the arena's perimeter hesitated for only a fraction of a second before moving to block the exit. The human stopped. Slowly, casually, he turned, then a sigh escaped his lips. You sure you want to do this? Xylvana descended the steps from her throne, her long cloak flowing behind her. I cannot allow this to stand, she said, her voice firm. You think you can humiliate my people and walk away? The human tilted his head. Yes, her nostrils flared. You misunderstand. A duel is one thing. But war? She stepped closer, her violet eyes burning with authority. That is something else entirely. At that, the human smirk returned. But this time, it was cold. That I was hoping you'd say that. The Kari fleet was already mobilizing even before the duel had begun. Xylvana had anticipated this outcome. She had not expected VA Corps to lose so swiftly, so completely. But she had known that if humanity won, they would become a threat, and threats to the Dominion had only one fate. Their warships were already entering human space. Their dreadnoughts, larger than cities, had begun the first steps of annihilation. The duel was never about honor. That IT had been a test. A final attempt to see if humanity could be absorbed, if they could be subjugated through the Kari's traditions. But now that she knew the truth, there was only one choice left. They had to be crushed. The human studied her, as if reading her thoughts. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver device that a communicator pressed a button. That go ahead. The response came instantly. A voice crackled through the air. Calm. Precise. Engagement confirmed. All assets moving into position. Xylvana's eyes narrowed. What have you done? The human met her gaze, and this time, she saw it, the same thing VA Corps had seen, not strength, not arrogance, certainty. You thought you were preparing for war, the human said. But the truth is, the war's already over. Above the Kari homeworld, in the cold void of space, reality shifted. The Dominion fleet, vast and unchallenged for centuries, suddenly found itself not alone. That humanity's forces had already moved, already anticipated this response, already positioned themselves to end it before it began. Did I end less than 10 minutes? Every Kari warship in the sector was surrounded. Their communications were jammed. Their engines were locked down. The Dominion had never been in this position before. For the first time in their empire's history, they were outmaneuvered. Xylvana's breathing was slow and deliberate, but the tension in her body betrayed her. You planned this, she said quietly. The human shrugged. Of course. We knew how this would play out. You were never going to accept a loss. You were always going to retaliate. His expression darkened. And humanity doesn't fight duels. His eyes locked onto hers. Did we end threats? The human tapped his communicator again. All units, stand by for surrender terms. Queen Xylavana's fists clenched. For the first time in the Dominion's long history, they were at someone else's mercy. Queen Xylavana had never felt powerless. From the moment she ascended the Kari throne, she had commanded a species that had never known defeat. The Dominion's conquests spanned hundreds of worlds. Its warriors crushed all who opposed them, and its enemies whispered their name in fear. But today, standing in the war arena of her own homeworld, she felt something she did not recognize. Not anger, not defiance, something far worse, inevitability. The human stood before her, hands still in his pockets, expression unbothered. His calmness was not arrogance. It was something more terrifying. Certainty that he had known from the moment he stepped into the arena. From the moment he dodged VA Corps' first strike. He had already seen how this would end, and now, so had she above the Kari homeworld. The Dominion's great fleet, the pride of their empire, was surrounded. Human warships had already outmaneuvered them. Before a single shot had been fired, their engines were locked. Their communications jammed. Their weapons offline. The war was over before it had begun. Xylara forced her voice to remain steady. You think this changes anything? The human sighed, shaking his head. I don't think. I know. Her claws twitched. We still have forces across the galaxy. You won't use them. The Queen bared her teeth. You assume too much. The human's expression didn't change. No, I assume nothing. I simply understand history. He gestured toward the sky, toward the warships that were now powerless against the precision of Earth's forces. This was never about a duel, he continued. It wasn't even about war. He met her gaze. It was about psychology. Xylara stiffened. Your empire is built on belief, the human said. The Kari don't rule because they have the strongest fleets or the most advanced weapons. His voice dropped, turning sharp as a knife. You rule because the galaxy believes you are invincible. Silence. He took a step forward, his presence unervingly calm. That belief just died in front of thousands of your warriors. Another step. Your greatest champion fell without landing a hit. Another. Your entire fleet was neutralized without a single casualty. Another. And now your people, your soldiers, are realizing the truth. He stopped inches from her. His voice dropped to a whisper. You were never invincible. Xylara felt her stomach tighten, because deep down, she knew he was right. For centuries, the Dominion had ruled through fear, through absolute confidence that no enemy could challenge them. But now, her warriors had seen it with their own eyes. Their champion, defeated without a fight. Their queen, cornered by a species that was supposed to be lesser. Their fleet, helpless against an enemy that had already won before the battle had even begun. Fear spreads faster than fire, and if fear took root in her empire, if her warriors began to doubt, then the Kari Dominion would crumble, not in battle, not in conquest, but in silence. And the absence of belief. Xylara inhaled slowly. She had no choice. What are your terms? The human smiled. The same quiet, knowing smile he had worn since the beginning. Simple. He turned, walking away, his job already done. Your empire stays out of human space. Forever. Xylara said nothing. She couldn't, because deep down, she knew the truth. The duel hadn't been a fight, the war hadn't been a battle, that IT had been a lesson, and humanity had just taught the Kari something they would never forget. The human stepped onto the transport waiting to take him off the Kari homeworld. General Mason's voice came through his earpiece, all forces standing by. Any resistance? The human glanced back at the arena, where Queen Xylara still stood, frozen in the weight of her defeat. He smiled. They got the message. The Kari Dominion would never challenge humanity again, because the galaxy no longer feared them. Now, it feared us. Humanity had arrived, and we weren't playing by anyone's rules but our own.